Good evening. Welcome. On behalf of the Charles Koch Institute, we appreciate all of y'all gathering together for this event this evening in Tallahassee. I personally appreciate being in Tallahassee because it means I'm back in the South. I can drink sweet tea, and I can say all of y'all, and not everybody looks at me funny. So it is good to be here. I'm also typically in Tallahassee as a Clemson fan for some sort of loss. So I'm happy to be here knowing that I can go home without dealing with a Clemson loss. But my name is John Hardin. I am the Director of University Relations, and we at the Charles Koch Institute are privileged and we're very thankful to be a part of a discussion about such an important topic as the topic tonight. Now, the Charles Koch Institute supports hundreds of programs like this one today, where we encourage debate, we encourage scholarship, and we encourage open conversations on critical issues. And the topic of criminal justice is one that is very close to the heart of Mr. Koch himself, and one that we at the Institute are actively seeking partners to build a movement, both in Florida and across the country, to address real reform possibilities. And though there are many opinions, I'm sure there will probably be some disagreements, it's our belief that criminal justice reform will lead to better lives, it'll lead to safer communities, it will lead to healthier economies and to a brighter future for the men and the women and their families that are currently caught up in the system. So for our part at the Charles Koch Institute, we are committed to bringing people together, like this event this evening, to exchange ideas in open and honest conversation and forums. And we hope that tonight will contribute to and advance these dialogues. So I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, who will then introduce the panel. He's a renowned conservationist, businessman, and historian. He has served as both a judge and a sheriff in Monroe County, and he is currently the director of the Project for Accountable Justice, an initiative that seeks to advance public safety through evidence-based practices and policies in Florida and beyond. So it's my pleasure to introduce Allison DeFore.
Thank you, John, and thank you particularly to the Charles Koch Institute for their support of this opportunity for us to have a dialogue. We're in the midst of a big conversation in Florida right now on these issues. 20 million people. It's almost amazing to think that Florida has 20 million people. We're now the third largest state in the union. I passed the ordinance a few months ago, so that's a level of seriousness that we're just not. I don't think anybody in the country is used to it. I'm pretty sure nobody in Florida is yet used to it, but that's where we are. And it's made me more amazing by the fact that my Mother's Day, Florida was the smallest and poorest state in the South, smaller and poorer than Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas. So we've come a remarkably big distance in a remarkably short period of time. And as we adjust to that, we're having to adjust to that in many areas, and justice is one of them. And it's occurring in the context of a national revolution in this area. So that's where all these thoughts are going to meet, is right here at this conversation this evening. And I'd like to thank Leon Wallman for the work in putting this together, and Deborah Brodsky, who is the actual director of the Project on Accountable Justice. I'm just the chairman. I work for her. I'm just the face. She's the brains. I'm just in sales. She's in manufacturing. So,
amen.
And true. And the Amen Corner was, we'll start with the introductions. Jerry Madden spent 10 terms in the House of Representatives of the state of Texas. He is the godfather of this movement nationwide, really. At the end of the day, it was he who was called into the Speaker's office and charged with this area that he had no background in, and brought a fresh set of eyes and a fresh face to it, and a background as an engineer, trained in West Point, and the results began to spread from there. He is now with the folks at Right on Crime and the Texas Public Policy Institute, and I'll let him explain that later. Next to him, on his left, is Greg Newbern with the Families Against Mandatory Minimums. Greg is a lawyer, a double-gator, so particularly to be cursed here in Tallahassee, but he's otherwise a pretty good guy. And he is at the front lines fighting for the reversal of mandatory minimums, which are a pretty major intrusion into the judiciary, in my opinion. When I was a judge, we had neither mandatory minimums nor sentencing guidelines, and I actually got to judge. Today, it looks a lot more like clerking to me than judging in many ways. Natalie Cato, to his right, is with the Human Rights Watch. Natalie is a tiger in terms of her advocacy for the things about which she cares, and she came to the Human Rights Watch world from staffing in the Florida Senate and a deeper background with legal aid and public defender. She's got a really huge heart, and she wears it proudly. Lauren Gaelic is here from Washington, D.C., from the Reason Foundation. She's here to help us from Washington, D.C. And she's actually the agent provocateur, and she will comes from the libertarian end of the world, which will actually, she will make me look like a reasonable person by the end of the day, I suspect. I consider her to be quite a bomb thrower in this town, and you're going to make me look great today. So she will bring the real stirring of the pot, and will then, of course, get back on our horse and go back to Washington, D.C. and leave all the hornets for the rest of us trying to figure out what to do with it, which is exactly what we've asked you to do. So with that, Jerry, could you, I think perhaps we should set the table first with some historical background, and sort of you can tell us how we got to where we are. And
I think, Allison, that the criminal justice reform movement, because this is what it is, has basically had three axes, one of which was a very liberal axis that tried to do stuff about people that were in the prison system. They've been going on doing that for a long time and generally failed, right? But they've been doing it. The second axis was Chuck Colson's introduction nationally that said there are people in this prison that are human, and we have to take them and give them some of the human respect that we would do to anybody else. And he did that through Prison Fellowship, did that through the Prison Rape Elimination Act, he did it through the Second Chance Act, and he recruited a good buddy of mine named Pat Nolan, who's doing it now nationally, doing a lot of wonderful stuff that got them going. The third axis started in Texas, and that's where we get, okay? Because it's the state axis. And I will tell you, it's the one that's rolling for everything right now. It's the one that's got all the momentum. When you look at states that are changing criminal justice policies in their way, you can look at almost all your neighbors, almost all. Georgia's done a remarkable set of things. They have great examples. Alabama is in the process. They're about to finish. And they might make it. And I'll tell you what, I went to Alabama 4 years ago, just the first time I went to Florida about, and I thought they had no prayer. They certainly didn't get it. They didn't get things like risk assessments and the right kind of tools and putting the right people in the right programs. They didn't get it at all. But they have now. Cam Ward, their senator there, is doing a remarkable piece of legislation. Mississippi, and guys, if Mississippi can do it, Florida, well, they used the talk that said if Texas can do it, why can't Mississippi? And that's been pretty favorably received all over the country. Places like North and South Carolina, they've done theirs too. They've cut their number of prisoners substantially in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And the people, that's not just prisoners in the state system, that's prisoners in the county jail that they went and did. But that's how did it start? Well, one day in January of 2005, the Speaker of the House, a very conservative Republican, who headed ALEC, and did some wonderful things with ALEC, but he basically called me into his office and said, Jerry, you're going to be chairman of corrections. And what did I do? Of course, I said, thank you, Mr. Speaker, what a wonderful honor. And under my breath, I'm saying, oh God, let me, what did I do to deserve this? But then I asked him one thing. And by the way, I'll tell you how bad the staff reacted to that. Is how bad did he dump on you? And how did you get that? And my wife's even worse. You got all the criminals? Okay, that's the only thing he can give you. So anyway, but I asked him a question. I said, well, Mr. Speaker, what do you want me to do? That was the second most important question I ever asked in my life. I said, what do you want me to do? And he gave me the 8 words that changed my life. He said, don't build new prisons. They cost too much. Now, I'm a West Point graduate. I'm an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. How do I do that? But yet that was my task. Where do you start when you don't know anything? Because I've never had a corrections bill. I've never been on the corrections committee. I'm not a lawyer. I had no background in it. Where do you start? Okay, I'll tell you where you start. First of all, you figure out a good working staff that can help you. And that does help a lot. You get a couple of right people, and then you can't hire a lot in the legislature, but a couple of them are really good. And then I go looking in the rest of the legislature for people who know anything about corrections. And guess what? How many people in the Florida legislature know a lot about corrections? Not very many, right? A few, maybe none, a few, probably. So I went out and I found a couple guys in the House who the Speaker didn't like, and so they couldn't help me a lot. But, okay, so I wandered across to the dark side of the Capitol, better known as the Senate, and I asked some of my friendly senators, I said, what do you guys, who over here knows anything about corrections? And they said, well, you know, there's one guy over here who we all trust. He's a member of the other party than we are, but we trust him in this subject. He knows the subject, and we trust him. So I walked into John McMeyer's office, and in the next hour and 45 minutes, I basically got together a partnership that is bipartisan. You heard the word that all this is going to be bipartisan? Well, it started because I walked across the hall and found there was a Democratic senator that knew what was going on. But I wouldn't look for any party affiliations. That I want to know who did something. But he and I hit it off just like this. We were not going, we basically had the task not to build new prisons. And how did we do that? And we started working. And so we looked at all of the areas in corrections, because there's a lot of areas. Don't limit yourself to just thinking about, well, we got to do something with the judicial side, or we got to do something with the juvenile side, or we got to do something with one area or another. We looked at the whole system, everything in corrections. We looked at probation, we looked at parole, we looked at prison, we looked at juvenile, we looked at actually looked at children and childhood cases and how do we deter. We wanted to figure out how did we break that cycle. We started one bill that year called Prohibition. And guess what? We passed it out of the Senate. Whitmire passed it almost unanimously. The senators are always like that. Passed it out of the House, not quite unanimously, but fairly good margin. Sent it to the governor. Guess what? The governor, we came up with a vote short because the governor vetoed it. Now, I will tell you, that's the best thing that ever happened. Because it forced us to go back and look at the whole system. Because we were going to do that. We were going to look at the whole system and see how do you make a difference in it. And so we started looking. First of all, I had think tanks, a couple of them, a conservative one and a liberal one in Texas doing criminal justice. That's unique. There's a lot of states that don't have that, although you've got the Madison Foundation, I know it's looking at stuff. But it's good to have them. I used them. I put them in the room and said, you guys got the probation bill, the governor just vetoed. You come back and tell me, well, what do we got to take out of this so the governor won't veto it next time? What are the good parts? Let's keep them, and do we need to do the other things? That was their task with ACLU and some of the governor's staff, Texas Association of Business, and some of the others. They got to do that. Okay? And then I said together, well, let's have a second group. I said, let's take these people who have been around this Capitol a long time, who want to do something. They come to me and told me all sorts of stuff. I said, let's look at programs. The programs that you have in the entire Department of Corrections. All of them. And let's ask the question, do they work? Are they working like they're supposed to? Are they not working? And if so, if they're not working, do we can them, or do we figure out a way to do something differently with them? And I'll tell you, we can to come with programs. You should. We had to. They were bad. They were what you would call stupid. By the way, I'm going to ask some questions now, and the answer is in almost all cases it's going to be a lot. How many people do you think we have locked up in prisons in Texas? A lot. A lot. Okay. More, a lot more than Florida has. 50,000 more than Florida has. How many people do we have on adult probation? A lot. A whole lot. 170,000 in felonies, 400 or something in felonies. How many people do we have on parole? Not as many as the adults system, but we had a lot, okay? So we had to deal with that kind of equation. And we started looking at, well, how do we keep from people coming back to prison? How do you slow recidivism? Because we had determined real quickly that in Texas there were two choices. You could either open the door and let them out of prison, or you could slow them down coming in. And guess what Texas did? It's pretty easy. We slowed them down coming in. We figured out ways to slow them down so that people weren't coming to prison that were not safety problems for the state, and we're not going to do all these criminal things if you could deal with them with programs in your community. Okay? We can keep them out of prison. So we started doing that. We started looking at all those programs. We put together a rationale for doing that, and started our 2007 legislative session, as John's supposed to know. And here comes the legislative budget board in with a projection that we needed to build. We needed to house 17,700 more prisoners by the year 2012. That's a lot, right? A whole lot. Okay? So we said, okay, that's not going to match our don't build the prisons criteria that we had. So we went, in looking at all those things, we said, okay, how much are they spending on new prisons? Because they put 3 new prisons in the budget at $530 million. And then the other group that was set up, besides the 2 that I talked about, was a statistical group. They basically had to take the results that my second committee had, and how many people, how many programs we need, what ones do we need where, and they had to turn it into projections of if we did that, what would happen to our recidivist rates, what would happen to our prison population, what would we get as a result? Data. Let me highly access the point that you have to have data in doing that. So we had data, lots of them. The data guys were all over the place. And the governor had fired them 2 years ago, a few years before that, because he didn't think he needed them. And we decided we'd use them, and we did, and put them to work in doing all the projections that we needed. Oh, look at that. Great stuff. We wanted to know how many people did we need in prison. We needed to know whether we were mad at them or whether we were afraid of them. We said if those people were mad at it, let's not get them in prison. Let's get something that changes them. So we were doing programs that changed them. We did substance abuse treatment, we did intermediate sanctions, we did mental health work, we did alcoholic treatment programs. We started an infant baby program for mothers of little babies that had them in the prisons when they came in. And they could keep them for a year in the system. We did things on the juvenile side a lot, because we had a little problem come up with the juveniles where basically we had staffers raping kids in our facilities. And we decided real quickly that that wasn't going to make them any better. So we totally reworked the whole juvenile system at the same time we're doing that. And I will tell you, if you're a legislator, tell your friends not to do that to you. It's really tough work. It's tough enough to do all the adult stuff, but it's really tough to do both the adult and the juvenile at the same time with all the pressure.
And your results were stunning.
The results have been
down of population and in crime faster than Florida.
the juvenile population in Texas and the prisons dropped from 4,600 to about 1,400. 70% reduction. Right? We have fewer kids being arrested, juveniles being arrested. We have fewer on juvenile probation than we used to have. We had local communities that we told, you have to do something. Now, we're not going to take misdemeanors. You have to do something about it. Who told us they couldn't do that. We told them, oh, hell, you're going to do it. Okay? And then we just flatly told them that was going to happen. And 2 years later, they come back and said, oh my gosh, you guys were right. Thank you for putting that on us. Because
I'm guessing Human Rights Watch would approve of such a thing.
Probably.
Jerry said they're human, so.
They probably would. And on the adult side, we took the prison population, actually built almost 5,000 prison beds called substance abuse treatment facilities. And put in 5,000 more people in there. And guess what? The prison population is below the number that we had in 2007 right now. Prison population down. Parole rates, when we started, we had about 21,000 people that were looked at for parole, and 11,000 came back every year. Last year, they had 28,000 that they looked at, and 5,900 of them returned. That's a huge difference in stuff that's working. things that are occurring that are. And so that's where it come from. And, you know, got started nationally with this right on crime movement because of what we did and people wanting to hear, well, how did Texas do that? And how did Texas do it as this conservative state with conservative legislators who, you know, have got the record of hanging on, you know, execute lots of people, which we don't do that much but as we used to. But we have still got that reputation. And we are tough on crime. But we wanted to be tough on the ones that needed to be tough on. And we wanted to make it so that the public was safer, which these things did, by putting people back in the community, by putting families back together. Actually, they are safer now than they were. So that's where we came. And nationally, it's just snowballed.
Okay. Snowball to the point that Human Rights Watch finds themselves in the same place.
Yes.
How's that working out?
So Human Rights Watch has a history internationally as a government accountability organization. That's how we started. That's what we've been doing for the past 30 years. We have one advocate based in DC, and when the U.S. program got some more money, they realized, as Mr. Martinez said, that state level work is really where the rubber was meeting the road in terms of criminal justice specifically. And that there was a really great opportunity for impact in the criminal justice world. You may be asking yourself why the international non-government organization that focuses on government accountability is doing criminal justice reform in the United States. And the reason is very simple. We noticed through our research that there is a lack of prosecutorial accountability. There's a huge nexus between some of these constitutional issues and human rights issues, specifically when they relate to children. So one of our chief issues is juvenile justice issues, but really specifically the adultification of children. So children that are tried as adults, sentences for children in the adult world, and really any situation where a child is treated the same way as an adult for doing something, for breaking the law. That wouldn't be a problem for us. We have also done some research that dovetails very nicely with the work that the Koch Foundation has been doing specifically on mandatory minimums, drug sentencing, and PREO, which is a federal issue, but we have been very involved in that. But we've been here on the state level for about 2 years. We're hoping to continue working here. We've done most of our work in Florida, but we have done a little bit in a couple other states as well.
Super. Greg, as I indicated, when I was in the judging business, we didn't have all these mandatory minimums and stuff. How did we get into this corner?
Oh, that would probably take a really long time to explain.
You don't have a lot of time.
I think a lot of times when it comes to mandatory minimums, you get a crime that's in the press, and someone wants to look like they're doing something about it. So instead of actually doing something about it, you have a press conference, you make it a new crime, you increase the penalties, and then you go home and you do that over and over and over again, hundreds and even thousands of times over the course of a couple of decades, and that's how we end up where we are now. Fortunately, the trend is moving in the opposite direction, and in part because of the work like that Jerry Madden was talking about. It's also Republicans who are leading the effort. It's been like that for quite some time, and I think there's this big myth that mandatory minimum reform is a liberal issue, is a progressive issue, and it certainly is. We've seen folks like Senator Booker at the federal level who are promoting this as well. But if you look at a lot of the reforms on the state level, these are very deeply conservative people who are leading the charge on this, going all the way back to Michigan in 2003. It was a Republican legislature, Republican governor, that repealed their very harsh mandatory minimum drug laws. It was a Republican governor in New York who repealed the Rockefeller drug laws. It's Republicans in South Carolina and Georgia who are creating new safety valves and reforming their mandatory minimum laws. It's folks like Senator Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz in the Senate, Tea Party Republicans who are leading this effort there as well. We've seen deeply conservative members of the legislature here in Florida who have embraced and even led on criminal justice reform and mandatory minimums. So just like the more broad issue of criminal justice reform is being led by Republicans, mandatory minimums, sentencing reform, these deep in the weeds issues of who we send to prison, why we send them to prison, for how long should we send them to prison. Republicans are leading the effort on that as well. And even Jerry mentioned ALEC. ALEC has a wonderful model safety valve. FAM is a proud ALEC member. We've worked very closely with them over the years, and we've seen that relationship bear fruit as well. There's a bill in Oklahoma, a very good bill that will provide and restore more judicial discretion that was sponsored by a very conservative chairman of the Corrections Committee up there, and it's moving its way through the process. So it's fun to be a part of that broad coalition of the left and the right coming together to recognize that something that we've tried for 40 years has been an overwhelming failure everywhere it's been tried, and now we're willing to take a step back and try new and better ways to achieve reform and better results. So not only here in Florida, but across the country, Republicans and Democrats together coming together and making it happen. So it's really cool to be a part of it.
Lauren, as we say down south, you ain't from around here, are you? So. Let's see you dance.
Okay, well. I'm a little intimidated now. So yes, I'm not from around here. But I've been very, I've done a lot of research on, what's happening in Florida. And I wrote a study that is out on the table out there. It's the high cost of incarceration of the Florida behind bars. So I became very interested in working on Florida issues just because it's such an interesting state. I'm from Ohio, and so I think that there's a lot in common with Florida as there is in Ohio politically. It's kind of a mixed state, more conservative, I would say. But I think that, as Greg noted before, and others on the panel, this has become more of a bipartisan issue, and I feel like this is an area in which Florida legislators could really lead on, because, to be honest, there are a lot of laws that have been enacted over the past several years that have done a lot of damage to taxpayer wallets and to human beings who have been locked in cages for years and years for nonviolent offenses. So I guess I'll just kind of dive in a couple of these specific laws that I target in the study. So first, I guess I'll just talk about the problem that has occurred in Florida over the past several decades. Between 1970 and 2014, the prison population increased by over 1,000%, which is enormous. But the regular population, just the entire state population, only increased by 198% over that same period. I mean, generally you expect to have more prisoners when there's more people, but that increase is pretty extreme. And your corrections expenditures have also increased enormously. Even over just the past 20 years, between 1994 and 2014, corrections expenditures increased by $1.1 billion. In 2014, Florida taxpayers spent $2.2 billion on the correction system alone. So that's a lot of money. And what has contributed to this? That's what I wanted to find out. And I highlighted a few laws that I found were the most problematic and have the biggest opportunity for reform. First, I talk about the drug trafficking statutes. When you hear drug trafficker, you think of a big drug kingpin who has, 2,000 pounds of certain drugs, just a lot of drugs, and has a lot of money and all that sort of thing. But in Florida, actually, their drug trafficking statutes for hydrocodone and oxycodone are pretty extreme. So those are prescription pain medicine that you can get legally if you have a prescription. If you don't, and you possess a certain number of these pills, you can be sentenced to a mandatory minimum of many years, depending on how many pills you have. So just briefly, I'll just give you an example of how many pills it takes to trigger a mandatory minimum. Judges are required to impose, and they can't individually determine what that sentence should be. They have to sentence that person to the mandatory minimum if they are convicted of these crimes. So it takes just 7 grams of oxycodone to get a 3-year mandatory minimum sentence, and that is about 14 pills, 14 5-milligram Percocet pills. And I just want to say that all these different pain medicines, they weigh various amounts. So they're not all the same weight. So if you have a certain brand of a type of pill, that might weigh more, so it might take fewer pills to trigger that 7-gram amount, or it might take more, depending on how much the actual pill weighs. 7-year mandatory minimum sentence, it only takes 28 of these Oxycodone Percocet pills. 15-year mandatory minimum, only 50 of these pills. That's not a lot. That's not what you would typically associate with drug trafficking, large-scale organizations. So I think that needs to be reformed. And by the way, these are the amounts that were increased during the last legislative session. Before, it only took 4 grams of these pills to trigger a 3-year mandatory minimum sentence, and that's only 8 of these pills. 8. Nothing. So, and to be convicted of this offense, you just need to illegally possess it or sell it to someone. So, some level of offenders have caught on that. I'll speed up. So, another thing that I highlight are the habitual offender statutes that can be used on nonviolent current convictions. In Florida, there are currently 105 individuals who have been sentenced to life without parole for a nonviolent offense, only because they have prior criminal history. So they might have had a violent offense in their past, but their current offense that they were convicted of was a nonviolent offense, and judges were required to impose this life sentence because of these habitual offender laws. Again, takes the judging away from judges, places the power into the hands of prosecutors who have the charging ability. I also touch on Florida's game time restrictions. So game time, incentive game time, states usually use this in order to incentivize inmates to either display good behavior or engage in rehabilitative programming, things like that, in order to reduce recidivism. So they're better when they get out than when they came in. That's what the point of prison should be, right? But in Florida, they have caps on the amount of credits that you can earn. All inmates have to serve 85% of their sentences at a very minimum. So it kind of discourages rehabilitation, and also it keeps people in prison for longer than they otherwise need to be. In my study, I cite data that Pew, they listed in their report that said that of the nonviolent inmates that were released from Florida prisons in 2004, 4,000 of them could have been released earlier without negatively impacting public safety whatsoever. But they were forced to serve 85% of their sentences, so they're wasting money, they're not getting back into society and rebuilding their lives. Letting them out wouldn't have hurt anybody, it wouldn't have it would have been a bigger risk for public safety. And if they did, then the state could have saved $54 million if they released them a little bit earlier than they did. So yeah, these laws have had a bunch of negative consequences besides that, increasing the elderly prison population by 600% over the past 20 years. I could go on and on, but I don't know.
You're doing great.
My understanding is Texas has not gone very far down the sentencing reform path. Is that?
Well, we didn't have mandatory minimum to start with, so it's not an important program. Did we do a lot? No. We said we could do what we wanted to do and needed to do without going there, at least at that time. And I think that was a successful thing for us to do. And then it kept people who might have otherwise opposed what we were doing, saying, boy, that's really soft cut term, 15 to 12 years or something like that. We'd have had a dropped them out, we didn't have all the DAs and all the sheriffs and all the other people that were out there really coming down too hard in the discussion. So, you know, it was a helpful thing for us to have. The other thing, I'm going to tell you, it's great to hear the people that are talking here, right? Because you've got to have that detail. You've got to know the details of what's there so you can make the reforms. For example that we had in Texas. And when you're done with this, I'm going to ask you what kind of criminal justice it was. We had a program which treated drug addicts in the prison. The parole board would say to the board of the Department of Corrections, person A is eligible for parole as soon as they finish this drug treatment program, 18-month-long program. Okay. Pretty good idea, right? The parole board said they're safe to go, and they're ready to go. One little problem. We had a waiting period of over a year before they could start. And we had over 1,000 people that were waiting for the program. How much does that cost? Oh, come on, I gave you an answer. A lot. That's a lot. Okay, 1,000 people for an extra year, that's a lot. Even if it's, you know, even if it's an extra 9 months, which, you know, we said it's rational and you can do it in 9. But we just opened the additional programs in the PDG guide. It didn't cost them much at all. A few trainers, and that was it. That's all they had to do to get rid of that queue, an engineering problem, the queue that they built up with these people sitting there waiting, and some of them getting their thing revoked. There are things like that happen in every system, I guarantee you. If you look at the weeds and you look at the nuts and bolts, you will find stuff like that in your system. And, you know, did it make it any less safe for us to let those people go 9 months earlier? I think they had the program that they needed, that the parole board had already said that's all you need. And we let them go. We didn't hold them an extra 9 months or 12 months or whatever it was. Right? And saved us how much? A whole lot of money. It certainly paid for the program all by itself. Okay? There are other things you can do in your system. Go look at, you know, go look at the women that are giving birth in your system and see what you can do for them. See if there's something that will make it so that that woman and maybe their baby won't come back into the criminal justice system. What a great thing to stop. You can stop it so that she becomes a better mother. And oh, by the way, the baby who in all our statistics says that the most likely baby that's going to be in criminal justice is somebody whose mom and dad are already there. There's a high probability that the kid's going to be there. How do you break the cycle? And that's one of the things we went and looked at was breaking the cycle. How do you do that? How do you do that with drug treatment? How many people do you have in prisons that have mental health problems? A lot. You got that one right. You got that right. You're there, guys. That's good. You have a whole bunch. Of your 100,000, I guess 25 or 30,000 probably has some sort of mental thing. I don't know if that's a good guess or not, but I'm pretty good at numbers, so I bet I'm in the right ballpark. You know, how much can you do if you divert them into something that changes the way they are? I mean, you know,
And that brings us to we need to get from the broad into the specific. We have at least one legislator here, Senator Evers. We're pleased to have you here with us today, sir. For those of you who might not be from here, he's been the champion of the bill to create a commission to govern Florida's Department of Corrections. So for folks like Senator Evers, who already gets it, but more importantly for some of the ones perhaps in the House who don't, what one idea would you have us carry to them to?
I do a simple.
And I'll ask each of you to give us one specific idea.
You gotta go first.
Oh, I don't know.
Specific.
I would pass a safety valve that covered all drug trafficking offenses.
Meaning what?
So you set certain criteria that allow judges, when defendants are convicted of drug trafficking, and recall that drug trafficking in Florida, like Lauren said, is simple possession of even very small quantities of prescription painkillers. So these folks go to trial, they get convicted of the offense, and the legislature would set certain criteria. If you meet those criteria, the judge can depart from the otherwise applicable mandatory limit. It would save tens of millions of dollars immediately. It would save thousands of lives. It would relieve a tremendous burden on the Department of Corrections, and it would be probably the single best reform that had an immediate decarceration impact that I would bring to the legislature.
And what criteria might those be, and what states have done this?
Oh, several states. In fact, Florida has safety valves throughout its statutes. We have safety valves for habitual offenders. The legislature passed a safety valve for hit and run last year. So we have several safety valves already in place. We passed a safety valve for our 10-20 life gun sentencing laws last year, in part thanks to the great leadership of Senator Evers and several others. So we already have safety valves on the books. In fact, we have safety valves for violent offenders and repeat offenders. This would just be the same idea, but for non-violent drug offenders. For some reason, we don't have the safety valve for that. But quite a few states have the same idea. And again, the ALEC bill I mentioned earlier is a model version of this. And the criteria might just be if you're a first-time offender, if you have no previous violent felony history, if you were not the leader or the manager of a criminal enterprise while you committed a crime, etc. If you reach those, the judge, it can be brought. The judge says this is a substantial injustice and it's not necessary for the protection of the public. Meet those two criteria, the judge says allow in court why he's making that determination, then you're subject to the safety valve. The federal government has a safety valve for drug crime. So this is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. It's a practical, pragmatic way to restore some discretion in the sentencing process, save a lot of money, reduce crime, reduce recidivism, and everything else.
All right, we have one idea in the basket. Jared, one idea?
I let the ladies go. I'll yield to the ladies first, because I know what else.
Oh, now I'm the rude person.
I'll
I also will yield to the ladies.
So I would say it is hard to pick just one because, as I always say, we did not build this system. We didn't build the system overnight, right? But at the same time, you have to go in small increments. And I also will admit that I'm a little biased. I think we need to take a hard look at the way we deal with children who end up in the adult system. Florida transfers more children than any state in the country.
Explain that for those of us who might not be familiar with the term transfer.
So, and let me stop for a second because there are states, for example, in Texas, where when you turn 17, the law treats you as an adult for criminal justice, for criminal purposes. So it's possible that some of those states, in theory, transfer more children, but as far as for a state where you become an adult when you're 18, Florida transfers more children. What that means is more children are put into the adult criminal justice system, are treated like adults in the eyes of the law in regards to everything, where they're housed pre-trial, the way they are sentenced, and the fact that they serve sentences in prison on adult probation. We do that to more children than any other state in the country. And we know what we have found from the research is that the ramifications of that are huge. It's not just about that body in that prison bed right now. It's about the long-term consequences. Children that are charged, that end up being tried as adults, are 30% more likely to reoffend and are 30% more likely to reoffend violently. What you're saying is that a child who is put in the adult system, sometimes for a low-level offense, is then exposed to hardened adult criminals in prison. They're not getting the services that they need. The juvenile justice system is designed to rehabilitate somebody. It's designed to figure out what's going on behind the scenes that made them break the law and address those problems, and ultimately fix those problems so that they can learn from their mistakes and become a productive member of society. But the problem is, as soon as you put a child in the adult system, you're depriving them of all of those services. You're also, and this was the title of the Human Rights Watch report that we did on this issue, branding them for life as a felon. You're saying that they can't get financial aid, they can't vote, they may have a hard time getting housing, and they're gonna have a very hard time getting a job. And that's going to make it so that that child is more likely to reoffend. And that label is going to carry them around for the rest of their life. We're telling these children that they don't matter before they're even old enough to sometimes drive a car.
And we have some proposals in front of the legislature this year on that, so
We do, but we could do more.
fair enough. One recommendation for our legislature in Florida before you head back to Washington to
I will kind of sneak around that. One recommendation, I would say I lay out several recommendations in my policy study that you should all pick up and please. But I agree with Greg. I think that, well, I would go a little bit further. I would say that drug trafficking for these specific substances needs to be significantly increased so that these low-level offenders aren't even before a judge who can then use the safety valve. They shouldn't even necessarily be in front of a judge facing this mandatory minimum sentence. But I'd also, you can only pick one, but I would really encourage, more incentive gain time so that people who can rehabilitate themselves, have rehabilitated themselves, can return themselves to society and become productive citizens again, instead of sitting in a cell when it's serving no benefit to public safety and costing taxpayers more money than it should.
Thank you very much. Jerry, one from you.
Allison,
We'll go to
you or Senator Everett have an idea of what I'm going to say?
Wow.
I bet you do. I'll bet you does. Because there was one thing that Texas didn't do in our process that we have since learned is absolutely one of the most important things you can possibly do in a state's change in their criminal justice system. And that's to set up the commission, that is part of the recommendation that Allison has, that basically says set up a commission to look at all your laws. Because you can look at hers, you can look at hers, you can look at his, you can look at all of them, and a lot more. And that gets bigger. That gets much broader. That's how we worked in Texas, but we had to, we set it up so that they were all coming to see Whitmire and I. That was hell. Okay? That was a hard thing to put together. Whereas these commissions have worked great in places like Georgia, and places like North Carolina, and places like Alabama, they're getting right to, and Mississippi, and South Dakota. I mean, they all were doing these things to look at their system. Okay, we can look at it from Washington, we can look at it from Texas, you can look at it from some segments. These are all segments, and the pieces can be put together by that commission, which is broad enough in its makeup that it's got almost all the forces you'll have in the criminal justice system. You can have them all at the table. You know what? You should have seen what Alabama did this last 2 months ago. Their commission bought into it. They have a rather well-known Supreme Court justice. They have rather well-known people in their criminal justice system. They have a large spectrum of different groups are there. And you know what? They were presenting great ideas. How do you do the things differently that makes smart criminal justice policies? And that's where I would go. I would tell the legislature, make sure you have a commission of some type in there to make recommendations to your next session of the legislature on what you need to do about the whole system. And you have to look at it all. It's not individual pieces. I mean, there's wonderful people that can give you great advice on those pieces, but you have to look at the big picture. The big picture is extremely important. Allison, you didn't tell me to say that, but I did.
You didn't. I didn't. I might have wanted you to ask, actually, but I didn't. We will now endeavor to ask some questions from y'all, or take some questions from y'all. This is a pretty seasoned panel, so feel free to jump in and feel free to disagree violently if you wish. But it looks like everybody here can handle it. We have somebody with a microphone who can jump in and allow you to be heard, and no holds barred Texas chainsaw. So have at it.
Great, thanks.
I'm very interested in the idea of
You can tell us who you are.
Oh, sure. So my name is Gabriel London. I made a film about a Florida prisoner called The Mind of Martin Reese, which y'all can see on Showtime now. And it deals a lot with parole and deals with a lot of mental illness issues in prison. What could be considered some mitigating factors that perhaps if looked at differently could have led to a shorter sentence. And one thing that I'm interested in is we talk a lot about smarter sentencing and ways of sort of moving forward and correcting the system now, is how do we look backwards at some of the people that are stuck in the system? What are the safety valves for the people that are already serving the mandatory minimums and that have mental illness and are trapped in there because their symptoms have exacerbated their sentences? Can we rebuild the parole? What are some of the options that you see?
A couple of things. First, the film's great. Very well done, and I encourage everyone to go watch it. It's really, really well done, and it's powerful, and it tells a very good story. FAM, we like to tell stories as well. That's one of the things we do is tell stories about people who are affected by these laws. And you mentioned the folks who are still behind bars despite reforms. And here in Florida, it's a paradigm example of that. We have an archaic, idiotic constitutional prohibition on automatic retroactivity of changes to criminal justice laws. And we passed a very good piece of legislation last year that dealt with our 1020 life laws. And here in Florida, we have 1020 life, a gun sentencing law. And part of that is if you commit aggravated assault with a firearm, you go to prison for 20 years if you fire a weapon during the commission of the offense. And we have a guy who's a dear friend to FAM, Lee Waller is his name. And this is a guy who has a master's degree. He worked at SeaWorld, a committed Christian man. He allowed a guy to come to his house. The kid was dating his daughter. And they had a bad history, the daughter and the boyfriend that would run off for days at a time. The parents wouldn't know where they were, so they let this guy come in part to keep their daughter at home. And one day things got violent, and the boyfriend hit Lee's daughter. And he came home from work, his daughter had a black eye, and things got heated, and he demanded that the boyfriend leave the house. And the boyfriend wouldn't leave. And Lee took his gun, and Lee's in his late 50s at the time. There's no way he could physically approach this person who just refused to leave his house. And Lee said, "Get out," and pointed his gun at him. And the guy sort of laughed at him and took a step forward, and Lee shot at the wall. Well, several weeks later, when the parents were threatening to send their daughter off to rehab, the daughter, who was on drugs at the time, and the boyfriend conspired to try to figure out a way to keep her out of rehab. So they called the police and said, "This guy fired a gun at me." And they looked, and sure enough, there's a bullet hole in the wall. They arrest Lee. They charge him with aggravated assault. He says, "I was defending myself, defending my family," cited our stand your ground laws, our broad self-defense laws, and went to trial. They turned out probation on him. Turned out 5 years of probation. He said, "If I get convicted of a felony, I'll lose my job, I'll lose my family, and it's too easy to break probation, I'll end up in prison anyway." He said, "Plus, I think I'm innocent of the crime." Go figure. So he goes to trial and he loses, and the judge has to sentence him to 20 years in prison. The guy had never committed a crime before, never hurt anybody, fired a gun into the wall of his own home, and what he thought was defense of his family, and he had to be sentenced to 20 years in prison. Now, and we passed a great bill last year to prevent that. It's a safety valve going forward, so that now, in that exact same situation, the judge will have discretion to sentence to some sentence below 20 years. But it doesn't affect Lee. Lee's in prison right now. He's got 10, 12, 14 years left on his sentence. He's in close to his 60s now. If he's not granted the commutation by the governor, he'll die in prison. He's been beaten in prison. He's had a rash that's been left untreated for weeks in prison. You should see he's just a fundamentally different person now than he was when he went in 7 years ago. So in Florida, we have this constitutional prohibition on automatic retroactivity, but I do think that there are ways that we can get around that. We can have creative language that says, let's let the legislature, in certain circumstances, allow their reforms to be to apply to people in prison. We have a commission on offender review now that's basically like a parole board, but since we don't have parole, there's very little for them to do for prisoners going forward. So you need fundamental transformation in the way we think about people who are currently serving. It's not just for people going forward. There are people who are dying in prison right now, and we can't just forget about it. There's 100,000 of them. We've got to look for ways that we can get some folks out. There's another guy, a 1020 life case. He's 70 years old. Never even had a speeding ticket. He took a 5-year deal to avoid a 10-year deal. It would have killed him. He would have died in prison. So he didn't even go to trial. He took a 5-year deal. Languishing in prison. The only way out for him is commutation. Not going to happen. Right, so I think that's exactly right. I mean, not only do we need these reforms on the front end, we've got to do something for the people who are already there. Otherwise, it's a hollow reform in a lot of ways. So thank you for telling the stories of people who are behind bars now, who still have their humanity. We've got to do something for them.
All right, Natalie, do you want to please?
Sure. And Greg kind of opened the door with this weird constitutional provision, and I'm going to tell you that it's called the Statutes Clause, and nobody really understands it. When we were working on Juvenile without parole reform bill a couple years ago, we had a big discussion about retroactivity because there's some Supreme Court cases, Graham versus Florida, Miller versus Alabama, that deal with reforming juvenile life without parole, and it was never really clear if Miller was specifically retroactive, so we were trying to figure out about putting it in the bill. And I did all this research, and I couldn't really find anything that dealt with the Statutes Clause. So, and it just so happens that we have a governor, this particular governor has a very narrow reading of the Statutes Clause in this, and we as advocates kind of know what Greg was alluding to, that if the bill is retroactive, and it doesn't just apply to criminal justice bills for this governor, so I can't accuse him of hating criminal justice reform. If a bill is retroactive, he vetoes it. So we have to work within that paradigm. But that being said, for us as advocates, I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure when we're discussing strategy, we do talk about litigation strategies for these cases. And that we work very closely with attorneys. My good friend Carlos Martinez is a public defender in Miami, he's right over there. Work with our public defenders, work with our criminal defense lawyers, and come up with litigation strategies so that we can try and find ways for these bills to be retroactive. For our juvenile life without parole reform bill that we passed last year, we knew that there was a case going through the Supreme Court that had retroactivity, and so ultimately that bill was held to be retroactive, so now there's an additional 200 people who had those sentences that are going to get a second chance and are going to get a chance to get out. So how do we as advocates implement that? I think that what we need is right now we're playing whack-a-mole. We're trying to see what will pass. We don't know what will pass, what version will pass in. So we as advocates need as much of a commitment as we can get from legislators that they're going to take a bill, whatever that bill is, be it, sentencing reform for drugs or for 1020 life or what have you, and that we're going to have legislators who are going to commit to getting a bill, introducing it all the way through and passing it on the floor so that we can work with the litigators and develop a litigation strategy to make sure that we can hold these bills retroactive.
And Lauren, do you have?
Yeah, I just have one quick point. Maybe just because I'm sort of a political outsider, I just write studies and I really focus on the policies, but I don't really get the politics behind being against retroactivity. I can't wrap my head around it.
Welcome to Florida.
I know. It's such a dirty word.
It's
No,
not.
a dirty word
It don't have to
everywhere.
make sense in Florida.
It's a dirty word everywhere. I just don't understand. If you're able to reform a bill and not subject new people to that law, why can't you at least reevaluate those who wouldn't be sentenced under the law if they were convicted today? I don't understand.
And in fact, Martin, you mentioned it, we passed a bill last year that raised some threshold levels for painkiller trafficking, and now the amount that it takes for trafficking for certain pills now, whereas last year, at this time, we've gotten 15 years in prison, now it might get you 3, right? I mean, that's a big difference, but there are people right now who are serving 15-year sentences, 25-year sentences for low-level painkiller trafficking, for now we'll get you 3 years or 7 years. This is a reform that we could pass tomorrow that would allow thousands of people to be resentenced under the law that everybody agreed last year.
Right,
was completely
don't
unpacked.
get too optimistic until you're doing.
No, sorry, we couldn't pass it tomorrow. In principle, we could pass it.
All right, next question.
I'm Carlos Martinez. I'm Miami-Dade public defender. And I think we would have to get a lot to the basics of particularly what's happened in Florida. The amount of unfettered power and discretion that the government has in the state of Florida, it is, to me, unbelievable, particularly in a very Republican state legislature. And what's happened in Florida, you can go back all the way to 1998 when the Florida prosecutors came in, and we used to have sentencing guidelines in Florida, and they came in and they lifted the sentencing guidelines and said the top of the sentence is going to be the statutory maximum. Except when they have priors or whatever, then if they go over the maximum, okay, we'll make that the maximum. So what has happened in Florida, we are losing the right to go to trial. Because the prosecutors have so much power by threatening, hey, you're facing X amount. So if you want to go to trial, there are situations where they will say, if you take depositions on the case, if you investigate the case, the plea is off. So not only are we losing the right to trial, we're losing the right to have counsel, the right to an attorney, for an attorney to investigate your case. So what has happened in Florida, we're looking at the outcome, which is a tremendous cost in terms of money and lives, but to our democracy and to our system of checks and balances, the damage to that, I think, is in the long term, the destruction of this country. So I think when I hear somebody like Grant Paul say, I want to take my country back, to me, I want to take my country back to a place where we have a really strong advocate system, adversarial system, with advocates on both sides, with judges being judges, and not having the system that we have now, that we essentially have taken the complete discretion from the judges, and we say, we're going to put it in the 20 prosecutors of Florida, rather than individual judges that have to go out and run for elected office. So for me, the reform starts there.
You're here.
I do actually, I do want to second that. Actually, I almost said that the single biggest thing we needed was to talk about prosecutorial reforms and abuses of prosecutorial discretion, because they do happen. They happen frequently. They happen in very insidious and scary ways, and it forces. I mean, if you're facing a 15-year mandatory minimum, and the prosecutor says to you, "I'm going to give you 5 years if you keep down this other thing," even if you didn't do the crime, it's very compelling to say, "I'm going to take that out of the plea." So, are there things that we can do as advocates? Yes. Are there bills that we can talk? Are there bills that we could pass on that? Absolutely. We could talk about transparency. We could talk about ways to put the power back in the hands of the judges. And those are absolutely things that we should be doing. But I would also task everybody in this room to really pay attention to what their local prosecutor is doing, because I can tell you the messaging from the prosecutors is always, if you have a problem with the way we're acting, we can always be voted out of office. But when all the problems are happening behind closed doors, you don't always know what the problems are.
That's a fantastic point. I'd add one quick thing. Part of the problem is, who are legislators going to listen to when it comes to criminal justice reform? And when a teachers union rep walks into a legislator's office and says, school choice is bad, but raises are good, legislators can look through that and say, I'm skeptical of what you're saying, right? If a taxi lobbyist walks into a legislator's office and says, Uber is really dangerous, but taxis are great, they can look through that because they understand the incentives that are built into why that taxi lobbyist would say it. But when a prosecutor walks into a legislator's office and says, mandatory minimums are great, somehow that skepticism just falls away. And they just assume, the prosecutor's telling me mandatory minimums work, they must work. If we apply the exact same skepticism that we apply to the teachers union rep, to the taxi lobbies, to the prosecutors lobby, to the police union lobby, we would get fundamentally different outcomes. If we just applied that same skepticism to special interests across the board, that would be in the criminal justice system, we would get fundamentally different and better outcomes. So that's just a very small shift in the attitude toward criminal justice. Who should we listen to? The answer is we should listen to the experts. Disinterested folks.
Skepticism is a good thing. I was much delighted to see Mark Caputo's logo that he's adopted the other day. He had doubting Thomas right there. And I didn't see many good biblical allusions anymore, but that was a good one for a reporter. We have time for one more question, so whoever would like to ask that question. Mark.
Allison, maybe to Republicans as a Republican, I think I'm joking here, was that, okay, it's live feed, was simply that if you went in and did a comparison of what it costs to throw away this kid with a few pills to 3.5-year sentence, and you've got a 47% prison population that is these kind of cases, versus what it would cost to send him to FSU, there's a few $1,000s difference. But I think basically that was how the approach we began with was, you've got a $2.4 billion corrections budget, and be good Republicans, and and don't be so afraid of locking them up and throwing away the key. I think we've made a lot of progress. I've worked a lot with reentry, and I see a lot of hard cases there where they're leaving reentry with a 5th grade reading education, $5-10 bills, and a bus ticket. It's not a good scenario. It seems to me we need to do more on the juvenile justice side. We've gotten rid of a lot of those retention beds that we, statistically prove are a disaster. But, for you, overall, have we not made some decent progress in the last 5 or 6 years?
We could barely give this stuff away 5 years ago and had to explain it to get people to even listen. And now I think we've had some pretty remarkable conversations today and over the last couple of days. So we have changed the temperature of the room, and everybody here is a part of that. If I can conclude maybe on that, let me just say this. We're just finishing a board meeting and then a sweep of things with the Project on Accountable Justice. Some remarkable partnerships that have emerged from the right and from the left. And today I was reviewing that with our board and actually with the Rotary Club here in Tallahassee, and was pointing out that we should never forget that these things can be changed. These are public policy choices, not public policy inevitabilities. There's nothing that says that Florida has to have 100,000 prisoners and a higher crime rate than the rest of the United States. We actually could choose to drop that number and drop both numbers actually at the same time. Other states have chosen to do that. In this state, when I became a young lawyer, which was some time ago, but most of what we're talking about is real evils here have arisen in my career, remarkably, which is really quite astonishing when you think about it. When I started, there were 2 federal lawsuits that had been filed. One was Costello, which dealt with the state system, and one was Edward McIntyre versus Billy Freeman, who was the sheriff before me in Key West. Edward McIntyre was a very, very smart jailhouse lawyer type, and the jail in which he was housed was a dungeon. It became my jail. I actually closed it and reopened a new jail. But at the time, feces would come on your head when you visit your clients on the 2nd floor from your clients on the 3rd floor. And McIntyre's lawsuit so thoroughly changed the culture of the 67 sheriff's departments in Florida that there are no dungeons like that left in Florida. And they set up first a system of oversight where people's eyes would come in for inspections. It was originally done by the Department of Corrections, and then ultimately shifted over to the sheriffs because they proved capable of it, and they found a mechanism that would allow responsible oversight of themselves, not in their own individual selves, but collectively in other people's jurisdictions. And the net result today is in contrast, frankly, to the Department of Corrections, where obviously you don't have to read any headlines to see that there's a very difficult cultural problem. There are 67 sheriff's departments in the state, and they range from very, very good to very, very mediocre to some not even that good. But there's not one of them that would have allowed a prisoner to be born alive because somebody would have said, stop that. In fact, it's so shocking that any kind of misbehavior in a sheriff's facility today that the sheriff in Liberty County, which is the smallest and most challenged one in our entire system, it's not really a system of them all, changed one line on an entry log of a prisoner in his own jail to unarrest him, which I thought was his prerogative to do. And he got reported to the newspapers and to the state attorney as an unusual event. So it is possible, my point is, to change cultures, even on a very, very broad basis in Florida. We got into this hole in the last really 30 years or so, and we could get out of it if we chose to stop digging and start filling it in. And that's the challenge that our legislature has this year. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your talk. Thank you to the Charles Koch Institute for hosting this, and thank you to the Charles Koch Institute